All right, I'm going to use video sparingly because I'm on the road, but I'll talk for a little bit at the beginning. I'm see if I can
Okay,
get this thing to work. There we go.
perfect. We are
All right, I'm going to use video sparingly.
we are casting live to YouTube tonight. Eric's suggestion, and I think that's great. A great way to involve more people. So give just a couple more minutes for, not a couple minutes, a few seconds longer for people to jump into the room here. We've got a lot of people registered for this event tonight. So looking forward to a great conversation, and just want to mention here at the onset that this conversation will is not, and we are speaking specifically to Washington state laws, but there will be a lot of information tonight that will be relevant to people all across the country, because what happens in Washington is similar to what happens in California. It does not stay there. So other states will be looking to implement some of these same policies. And we will be talking about some of the federal issues pertaining to firearms as well. All right. So good evening. I am Julie Barrett, founder of Conservative Ladies of Washington. You are joining us for week 5 of our summer SmackDown legislative series. Tonight, we are talking about your 2A rights in Washington and beyond. We've got an all-star panel with us tonight. We've got Mr. William Kirk, president of Washington Gun Law. We have got Senator Linda Wilson and Representative Jim Walsh. And we've also got from our team, we've got Eric Pratt, who I like to call him Washington's unsung hero. He's very involved in state legislation, and he is much more well-versed in firearms than I am. And so he's going to be assisting us tonight with our discussion. We work with very closely with William Kirk of Washington Gun Law on all of the 2A legislation. He is really, he and I, as he likes to say, we geek out a lot during session, and we strategize together. And a lot of what comes out of Conservative Ladies of Washington pertaining to 2A is because of this partnership and the work that we do together. So I certainly could not do this without his expertise. And I know that we've got a lot of Bill Kirk fans in the house tonight, and it is really a treat to have him with us. He is so knowledgeable on this, and he is really a great resource for citizens in our state and citizens all around the country. So thank you, sir, for joining us tonight. Thank you, Senator and Senator Wilson and Representative Walsh, for taking the time to join us tonight as well. Bill, I'd like to kick it over to you to start. I'd like it if you could kind of give us sort of an overview of what happened in the session. And, you know, I know there's been a lot of legal stuff going on in the courts with some of these bills. Can you kind of give us an update and your perspective on all this?
Quick, get us up to speed. Well, obviously, Senator Wilson and Representative Walsh could speak to what happened in the session. They were in the trenches, and it certainly was not for a lack of effort on either of their parts. I think they should both be commended for the warrior-like efforts that both of them had in their respective chambers. I do encourage everyone to go back and watch Senator Wilson's questioning of Representative Peterson. It was absolutely one of the few enjoyable moments that came out of the legislative session this year. There was a lot of bills that passed, but the ones that most affect the people who we're speaking to tonight, of course, was House Bill 1240, which is a ban on semi-automatic rifles and many other firearms, now labeled as assault weapons. That has been the subject of significant amount of litigation already. There was also the bill that passed, I don't recall the number exactly right now, but it was one that had a great extension of liability for FFLs. That certainly we're beginning to see a huge impact on the FFL industry as a whole because of some of this legislation, as well as some of the things happening on the federal side. We're seeing a slow choking out of the FFL industry. And then there was House Bill 1143, which was essentially a pre-purchase, started as a pre-purchasing licensing requirement. The good folks in both houses there, in both chambers on the Republican side, got that thing really whittled down. It certainly came out as a much more watered down version than where it started. That's a pre-purchasing educational requirement that doesn't take effect for about another year. So that hasn't really been the subject of a lot of the ire of the gun owners in Washington state right now. What certainly has been House Bill 1240, the assault weapon ban. There's been 3 lawsuits that have been filed on that, 1 in state court, 2 in federal court. We've covered them very carefully on the channel. The one case in state court was a case of Guardian Arms versus Inslee, originally filed in Grant County. I was concerned and had spoken to counsel of record on that there was a way that we could get what I call hometown, which is get this thing knocked out of Grant County and back down to Thurston County. That's exactly what happened. And once that happened, I think we all kind of knew where we were headed from there. The suit on the merits itself is still yet to be set. However, as we know, the motion for the statewide injunction was denied by the state court. So we live under the wrath of 1240 for that. There was a second suit that was filed in Western District of Washington. That is a case of Hartford v. Ferguson. That case, there was a motion for an injunction on that. We covered the ruling on that one, a terrible ruling that came out of that court. So the motion for an injunction has been denied there. There is, of course, still a pending full trial on that case. And then the third case, and the one that, for whatever reason, maybe it's the pleadings that are so well drafted or where it sits or whatever, the one that I am at least mildly optimistic on, and perhaps it's the only one that's still alive, that's why I'm still optimistic, is the case of Banta v. Ferguson. It's filed in the Eastern District of Washington. We have a motion for a statewide injunction coming up on that. The channel has covered the pleadings on that the last couple of days. I am hopeful. So that's what's the litigation that's happened from this year's legislative session. And then let us not forget that we still have 2 lawsuits kicking around, which is Sullivan v. Ferguson and Brumback v. Ferguson, which are 2 suits, one in Western Washington, one in Eastern Washington, which is still a challenge to last year's magazine ban. In the Eastern District of Washington, we had been waiting for a ruling on an injunction. All the pleadings were due December 16th. Court promised us the ruling on December 23rd of 2022. As we sit here today, we still don't have a ruling out of Judge Dimke over there. So that is, in a real nutshell, everything that's happened from our perspective.
Thanks, Bill. Senator Wilson, could you jump in and tag on to that from a legislative perspective on, I know we started with, I feel like it was around 12, but maybe it was even more than that, kind of what you see from a legislative perspective as kind of what the plan was and how things sort of shaped up from that.
Well, sure. Thank you. And thank you for having this forum. It was a hellacious session this year. It was very frustrating. As you know, and you probably all have been paying attention to the arguments that are always made, instead of making the criminal, going after the criminal, we're going after law-abiding citizens and gun owners. And that, we always think that we're going to get in there, we're going to give them the facts, and we're going to explain it all to them, and they're going to figure it all out, and they don't care. They don't care about the facts. So we get up there, we argue. I mean, when we went for hours, both the House and the Senate went for hours on these bills, just to try to talk some common sense. And when you talk about like 1240, which did seem to be like the biggest bill, although I think that the one that is going to affect Washington even as much is the 5078, right, which is the gun manufacturer bill. I was really worried about that one because it's all encompassing, and I can't imagine that it's not going to be found unconstitutional, especially with interstate commerce, right? Because if someone does something with a gun criminally in the state of Washington, they decide to sue the gun manufacturer, it's the gun manufacturer in any state in the union. So it isn't just Washington. It's completely, all other 50 states. So that's a real concern, particularly when you have people selling these firearms, and they cannot get the liability insurance that they need to be able to sell or manufacture. So I work with Daniel Mitchell down here in Vancouver, who is very, very up to date and very effective in the legislature when he comes to testify. And so we depend on Bill Kirk. We depend on all of everyone that can come in and basically tell everyone common sense, right? It's particularly for me, I come at it with a women's perspective. So years and years ago, before I ever ran for office, I went out and I bought my first AR-15. I was all excited about it. My brother-in-law is a photographer, and he says, I want to have you give me your best Bonnie and Clyde. So my husband was like this, and I'm like this, and I have an attitude on my face, and I have the picture, and I put it out on Facebook, and I'm like all excited because I got a new gun. Well, then I decided I was going to run for office a few years later. Well, the picture's out there, right? And so that's when I decided to become a firearms instructor. And so I took 2 of my daughters with me. We went down to Arizona on the weekend and did it because I needed credibility. And by the way, they never used the picture because they did say they had the picture. But that's the direction. So when I go to work with my daughters, when they have classes, it's the women that come in. They want it for self-defense. It's common sense, right? When I explain an AR-15 and all of the accoutrements that come onto the AR-15, it's because it makes it easier for us to shoot. It's more accurate. We don't have the recoil, all of that stuff. So, you get up and you start to explain that. And, we had a bill, because I'm in law and justice. So the bill comes through that committee before it gets to the floor. So I'm arguing about why we want the rails and why we want the pistol grips and all that. And, they don't care about all that. They just go back and go, but you're killing kids, right? You're killing people. And so the argument was, I went, okay, we backed off of that whole thing and said, this can't work. We can't do this. So you go through a process, because in committee, you find out what their arguments are and how they're going to respond on the floor, which is where most people pay attention, the people that do pay attention. And so that's where I think that's where our strategy comes in, and we hope to get the information out there and how we believe and why we believe what we believe. And so, without going into individual bills, because we can do that later if we want, but the arguments, even in the intent section of 1240, was atrocious. And we got up and we said that, because what they said was entirely, they were lies. I mean, it was going to sell, right? It was to their base, and that's what they need. So I don't know. It's frustrating.
It's extremely frustrating. And you mentioned something that I was wanting to ask you about tonight. We have a lot of ladies listening in and watching tonight. And, since I started Conservative Ladies of Washington, a little over 2 years ago, I have heard from countless women across the state of Washington about wanting to, learn about firearms and purchase a firearm and get trained and be able to have that protection for self-defense. And one of the things that I believe you spoke to this on the floor, or at least in committee, but there was I believe it's in House Bill 1240, where they talked about the hyper masculinization of these weapons. And I think that, I think a lot of conservative women are kind of onto the rhetoric by now,
right.
But some of these, firearms can look intimidating, right? Like the AR-15 can look intimidating, but it is truly, I mean, I would rather fire an AR-15 than a handgun. It's just easier to hold. It's easier to shoot. What would you say to women who might have been just sort of, taking all this in over the session and wondering, how they can get involved in, purchasing a firearm and getting trained? What would you recommend to them that might be now even more intimidated because what will people think of me?
Right. Well, if you go into any FFL and they're going to go sell you a gun. Now, why I find interesting is over the course of the years, when I have gone or I talk to women who want to go purchase a gun, their husbands say, go buy a revolver. It's like, oh, ouch, right? Because for me, I can't practice with a revolver. It would be a semi-automatic handgun. And for me, I prefer the handgun even more than the AR-15, but the AR-15 is so accurate, right? And so that's why it's so good for self-defense and so much less recoil. But, find other women that own other guns or their guns and just talk to them about, because you can go into certain firearm stores and shooting ranges, and you can actually rent the guns and practice with them before you ever go out and shoot. I think that's really very important for women because it totally makes a difference in the difference between whether you want to have it for home personal defense or you want to carry it on yourself, right? Because you don't want a full-size firearm on your hip. If you want to carry it, you want a smaller one, but a decent size caliber so that it will, do the job, whatever that is, right? But talk to other women. I think there's more and more forums out there for women that want to get involved because they want to have the ability to take care of their own families and themselves. Too many single women out there that don't have that capability right now. And they're making it harder and harder for women or anybody to get a firearm. The 10-day waiting period, that was my argument all along. What about the single woman that has I work with domestic violence as well. And some of these bills, they want to protect themselves against their estranged husbands or boyfriends or whatever they are. And they have to wait 10 days. Even if they have a CPL, you have to wait 10 days. So, it's all about the training and sharing your stories with other people and getting them out there. There's a lot of places where it will be safe to do that.
Yeah. And I think you made a good point about, talking to your girlfriends and seeing what, if you can, go to the range with them and try out their firearms. And I think sometimes shooting with other ladies is less intimidating than maybe with, a male instructor or something like that. So
Yeah.
that is great advice. I'd like to turn to Representative Walsh. Senator Wilson mentioned about, the hours that you all spent debating these bills. And I'm wondering if maybe you can talk about sort of the strategy behind, I think with each of these three bills that we're talking about tonight, 5078, 1240, and 1143, there were a number of amendments that ate up time. Can you talk about kind of the strategy so that citizens understand what y'all are doing there?
Well, sure. I mean, our strategy is to make passing unconstitutional laws as time consuming and painful for the Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader as they can be. We've been able to kill a couple of anti-gun bills in past years by loading them up with amendments so that the Speaker would see that the floor debate, given so many amendments, 80 or 100 amendments on a single bill, would take several days. And they just don't have the will to fight that hard. However, the Speaker and the Senate Majority Leader have some cards they can play in response, primarily sort of parliamentary maneuvers for calling certain amendments trivial or redundant and not valid policy changes to the underlying bill. So there's some parliamentary maneuvering and positioning we do in advance of these bills getting to a floor debate. Senator Wilson spoke about it. I mean, we have committee hearings which happen before floor debates and floor votes. And in those committee hearings, generally we try to let the gun grabbers do most of the talking so that we can prepare our floor tactics, our floor amendments, our floor arguments. But we test some amendments, we test some arguments at the committee level, but the real focus is on making the floor debate and the floor vote as time consuming and unpleasant and difficult as it can be. One of the side effects of decades of what is essentially one-party rule in Olympia is the gun grabbers have very poor debating skills. They're not used to making arguments because they don't have to. They generally have votes and they can ignore debates and just wait out our arguments and get to their votes. But we have ways that we can make that apparent to anyone who's paying any kind of attention, and seed the eventual lawsuits against the bad bills that become bad laws with basically advance notice, advance warning of what the problem sections of these anti-gun bills are. And the three that we're discussing primarily today, the three worst out of last session: 1240, the so-called assault weapon ban; 1143, the so-called training requirement; and 5078, the so-called bankrupt FFLs, are all patently unconstitutional. And the state attorney general, who has basically fronted these bills, and the current governor, they don't care. They don't care about the Constitution. And in the long game, beyond what's intimidating and what's not, beyond making marketing appeals, the long game is to impress on people that these individuals, these proponents of unconstitutional law, are not legitimate legislators or executives of a constitutional government. The word tyranny gets thrown around a lot, maybe too much, but in these ways, these small people act like wannabe tyrants. Ultimately, I'm optimistic. I think the courts will, in time, rule that these three bills, each of them, are unconstitutional, at least narrow their scope, maybe repeal them altogether. And in the meantime, we will continue to try to put sand in the gears of the anti-constitutionalists, unconstitutionalist, wannabe tyrants. Article 1, Section 24 of the Washington State Constitution is clearer and stronger than the Second Amendment to the federal Constitution. It does not make any reference to a well-regulated militia. It says plainly that the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right, and that common good, in the form of common security and common safety on streets, comes out of the individual's exercise of the individual right to keep and bear arms. And as most viewers and listeners will know, the action verb that Article 1, Section 24 uses is impair. The state shall not impair the right to keep and bear arms. That's even more significant than the federal Constitution's use of the word infringe. All three of these unconstitutional bills, each in their own way, impairs the right of an individual in this state to keep and bear firearms in defense of himself or herself and the state. And it's important that what Article 1, Section 24 says is in that order, that the right to bear firearms in defense of yourself and the state shall not be impaired. It's brilliant because it says plainly that by exercising that individual right to protect yourself, you protect everyone by making the state a safer place. And you have to be really malevolent to read that language and think that any one of these three bills would pass constitutional muster. They simply won't.
Thanks, Jim.
Sure.
We have so many questions tonight, and I know that people are really feeling, kind of fatigued after this session. And so hopefully tonight we can give them some ways that they can get involved and continue this fight, because we cannot give up. We have to continue this fight, even though it seems like we can't win. I think that there's always hope, and we just have to keep trekking forward. And it's encouraging to me to see people like you and Senator Wilson and in this game and fighting so hard in Olympia for us. And I know that there's so many others on your team there in Olympia fighting as well. Eric, I want to kick it over to you. I know you've got some questions for our team. So go ahead.
All right. Thank you so much, Julie. I'll try and make it quick and concise to the point. First off, let me say thank you, Senator Wilson, Representative Walsh, and Mr. Kirk for letting me sit in on this and sort of take part. One of the questions I have that's sort of, I think, on a lot of people's minds is we can recognize sort of the environment in Washington politics for what it is right now. And as I've been witness to, and Julie, as we sit in these hearings and watch the debates, we see the sort of what we're up against. And as a result of that, we look at it negatively, but we look outside the state positively towards some of the things that go on in hopes that they might help us in the long run. And while we see these bills that have come off of the legislative floor and across the desk of our governor, and we consider them and see them for what they are, unconstitutional, we look outside the state to the other places around the country that are making strides towards retaining constitutional values. And I wonder, from my standpoint, I don't know how that affects us in Washington in what our work is here, such as the cases that are being fought by the Silent Majority Foundation right now and on these various bills, as well as some of the others. And I'm wondering how those fights, such as in the Fifth Circuit that we just watched happen. I think Mr. Kirk just did a video of some really great stuff about how the ATF has kind of been put in their place regarding some of their issues regarding the frames and receivers, and how those might affect what happens in Washington state law, such as with the 1705, which was passed in, I think it was 2022, regarding the homemade firearms. I'm just curious, what does that mean for us? When we see that happening out of our state, does it help us in any way?
And any one of you can take that.
Well, let me jump in. And it's a good question, Eric. And I can only give you my perspective, but what I try to do as both a lawyer and then try to be an educator on YouTube is I like to base everything I say on evidence. It just seems that your argument is always so much more effective when there's evidence backing it up. And so what I'm encouraged by when you see a lot of these constitutional carry states, let us not forget now, we are 26 states in the country are constitutional carry, and we're about to go to 27. So we have a majority of states. When we start seeing states that don't have these bans, when we start comparing the crime numbers, when we start comparing the violent crime numbers, the data is there. It clearly shows that none of these gun laws work. So what I'm encouraged about is that it gives people like Senator Wilson, Representative Walsh, some true data to go in and argue their points. Now, unfortunately, they have gotten to a point with the numerical value of the Democrats in both chambers that they don't have to engage in debates anymore. And anyone who geeked out and watched the debates know that, you know, some people like Senator Wilson, Representative Walsh get up and they give these very, not only impassioned, but very well thought out, well reasoned, well researched statements. And then somebody from the other side gets up and just talks about some terrible shooting, many of which don't even occur in Washington state. And they sit down and that's what happens. So, but I do think we need to be encouraged, because I think we're beginning to see that there are a lot of other states that are choosing to go the other way. And we are going to have some clearly identifiable data in the future to determine, do these gun laws actually make a difference? Now, those of us in my community know they don't, but it would be really nice to have the proof and the numbers.
You know, I got to play off of that because I ran an amendment to ask them to follow up on the data, right? And no, we don't need to do that. Well, you know, where do they go? They don't intend to make things better. You know, they created one of the worst bills I thought we had was last year, year before last, the Office of Gun. Oh gosh, now I'm thinking the Office of gun. I can't remember the whole last thing of that particular office that they created, right? Looking to get data, but it's going to be. We knew that there was no funding for that agency. It was creating a whole new agency because we need a whole lot more agencies in Washington State because they're so great. But this particular one was really worrisome because we knew that they were going to go out and find data to fit what they needed to talk about, right? And that kind of thing. And that's years ago when we had a Law and Justice Committee meeting. It was actually in Representative Walsh's district. We were actually talking to those in the government about shots fired. It's a program that they want to know where the guns, where the shots are actually fired, who's shooting them. But I asked them straight up about gangs, and they have no intention of looking at the data that comes from gangs. When you look at, especially when you're looking at children's and the how many children are killed, they're not looking at the gang data. So many of these are gang on gang shootings, but they're manipulating the information so that it sounds a lot, I wouldn't say worse, but they just spin it so that it works for them, rather than what are we going to do about the gangs in our communities and hold them accountable, because what they're doing is they are reducing penalties for gun crimes. And instead of what we want to do is hold the criminal accountable, because criminals don't follow the law. We do. We want to follow the law. That's why they're passing all these bills. So.
Well, that kind of leads me, if I may jump in again, into another question, after watching this last legislative session, it seemed like the Republicans put forth a number of bills that actually had the idea of prevention of some of the violence and sort of law, helping to enforce laws that would reduce the impacts of the criminal activity, the increase in criminal activity we're seeing. Were there any laws that were put forth by the conservatives to sort of address these issues that weren't unconstitutional like this, but that would have gone forward to solve some of these issues but were denied?
Well, I did have one. I'd run one several years in a row, which was makes the theft of a firearm a Class B felony. It increases the penalties if they actually steal a firearm and use it in the commission of a crime. So I've been running that, and I can't get a hearing in the committee. Yeah. Right.
And I was going to bring that bill up because Senator Wilson is dead right about that. And I even did a video about this. And Julie knows this because this is a stat that her and I have geeked out on it before. But we know that the United States Department of Justice, their own statistics say that 88.8% of all gun crimes committed in the United States are committed by a person who's unlawfully possessing the firearm at the time that the crime has been committed. So we have the data, and we have the identifiable demographic group that's creating all the problems. So then along comes Senator Wilson, who goes, hey, listen, we got the identifiable problem. Why don't we write a law to address that? Brilliant. Who would have ever thought of doing something like that? And it does exactly that. It stiffens the penalties for stealing firearms. It stiffens the penalties for using stolen or unlawfully possessed firearms in the commission of the crime. It essentially addresses the actual problem. This year, that bill never got a committee hearing. It never got a pulse. It was dead on arrival. And for anyone to suggest, and then you look at the crime numbers, you look at the number of crimes and the crime statistics in the state and how horrible it is. And so you think about it. Here is a person who's actually drafted legislation that identifies the problem, and the people who are claiming to want to save lives doesn't even let that bill see the light of day. And it makes absolutely no sense.
Yeah.
Because their purpose is not to save lives. Their real purpose is to erode an individual's right to protect herself in her home.
Right.
We can use numbers, we can use statistics, we can use facts and logic all we want. As Senator Wilson said at the beginning, they're not talking about facts and logic. They are using overwrought emotional appeals to justify an unconstitutional agenda to rob people of their independence and their ability to defend themselves. It is, I mean, that is the game. So I really think our retreat and our appeal to authority needs to be more focused on the existing Constitution and its clear protections of the individual's right to defend yourself. It is right there in black and white. And, you know, that has got to be our own chief.
Can I jump in here with sort of an add-on question to this? Since these bills have passed and 1240 passed with an emergency clause, so it went into effect upon signing. And it feels like, and maybe it's just my perception, but it feels like when I scroll through Twitter on a daily basis, I am seeing every single day, you know, shootings and deaths and all of this quote unquote gun violence happening in Western Washington. Specifically, has the crime committed with firearms, has that increased, would you say, in the last few months? Not necessarily, you know, due to all of the policies at large. And is this something that we could exploit in order to get them to maybe reverse course a little bit next session?
Well, Julie, I recently did a video that was called "What Do the Numbers Really Show Us About Washington's Gun Violence Problem?" And it was a study that was published by the Washington Association of Chiefs and Police and Sheriffs. So, you know, I think it would be a pretty reliable source as to violent crime that's occurring in their jurisdictions. And what we have seen annually since about 2017, about the time the Democrats really started cracking down and trying to pass all of this gun legislation, is we've seen a slow and steady increase in homicide and other violent numbers in Washington state. During the pandemic, we saw an alarmingly rapid increase of it. Right now, in 2023, the good news is that we appear to be leveling off. I would not say the numbers are going down, but they appear to be leveling off from 2022, which was, by the way, the most homicides ever committed in the history of Washington state. And it was a record-breaking year. When you look at the actual study from the Washington Association of Sheriffs and Chiefs of Police there, what you find out is that of all the people murdered by a firearm in last year, seven individuals in the state of Washington were murdered by a rifle. Now, that is a rifle, which means that includes all types of rifles: bolt action, pump action, lever action, and semi-automatic rifles. Let us also remember that those numbers would include any individual who was lawfully shot by a law enforcement officer, such as from a SWAT team, which oftentimes does deploy rifles, okay, and anyone who used a rifle for suicide. So in the year 2022, we had 7 people die because of a rifle. And in the year 2023, the Washington State Legislature, those on the left, believed that we needed to ban all semi-automatic rifles and many other firearms. So getting back to what Senator Wilson and Representative Walsh have been saying, it is not about saving lives. It is not about the numbers. It's not about addressing the problems. It's about depowering the individual, stripping the Washington individual of their powers.
And I suppose the other thing is, every time we bring this up, we talk about mental health and why these things keep happening, and they dismiss it. They dismiss it outright. And so I mean, I've gotten attacked at my own town halls, screaming and yelling at me because I've said we have a mental health issue, but they don't want to know what the data is, right? And we've been just fined $100 million because we aren't when people get arrested, they can't stay. It's True Blood. They cannot stay in jails, and they are required to get help. And the state has been failing on that for years. And so we've just been fined $100 million. We're going backwards. We have another place that's just been closed down, another hospital that's been closed down that had almost 300 beds. Now the state's trying to figure out how to keep the beds online. But this is exactly what we need. We have to figure out what's going on mentally. What has happened you know, and I say over and over again, back when I was a kid, and I'm even before, even, you know, I mean, I'm pretty old, but I'm saying that, you know, way back when these people would take their firearms, they'd take their guns, they put it in the rack and behind in their truck, and they go hunting after school. We didn't have this. We didn't have to worry that Johnny, who brought his gun to school in the back of his pickup, was going to come shoot us in the middle of lunch hour, right? We just didn't have to worry about. So what's happening? And that's really where I would like to go. I would love to have some research. I mean, is it video games? Is it mom and dad? You know, there's less and less mom and dads together, right? There's more and more single moms. I mean, what is it that's causing this breakdown? And that's why this isn't going to work. We're not going to see, because they steal the guns. If they're not buying the guns from an FFL, they're stealing the guns, and they're committing these heinous crimes, and you know, and they're not being held accountable. So,
and then couple that too, Senator, with the fact that as you talk about mental health, we also have this horrible drug problem, and that drug problem leads to a lot of abhorrent behavior and leads to a lot of mental health issues. And what does the legislature have to show for this horrific drug problem that we have in this state? And how are we addressing that, which creates safety issues for everybody?
Mm-hmm. That's exactly right. Going the wrong direction. Yep.
Well, the mental health problem in True Blood is intimately tied with addiction. And that's an unspoken truth, but everybody knows that's part of the True Blood ruling. There's True Blood is an interesting issue. And the way that behavioral health, which is the code word for drug addiction, and mental health interact with this infringement and impairment of gun rights is a finely written symphony. But True Blood is an interesting issue. It binds some of us on the right with some of our colleagues on the far left, in that the issues raised by the court in the True Blood ruling are legitimate issues. The state of Washington has mismanaged its mental health care facilities because the current majority doesn't believe there should be mental health hospitals. And so they've run them all into the ground, either through mismanagement or poor budgeting, and basically opened the asylums and emptied them out. And that is done in part, I believe, to create an overall sense of chaos and a lack of order, which should make law-abiding citizens even more protective of their constitutional right to protect themselves and defend themselves. And I am optimistic, even though a lot of our conversation sounds like a downer, and that will ultimately happen. And I think it's beginning to happen. I think people are beginning to see that if we are going to have a state where homicide rates are up every year, where violent crime and property crime are up every year, people want to know they can protect themselves. And these virtue signaling, unconstitutional poses will have less and less traction. I mean, every town and Michael Bloomberg have worn a lot of the teeth off their gears, and people want to protect themselves. And I think we need to appeal to that. I also don't want to let our conversation imply that House Bill 1240, the so-called assault weapon ban, only bans certain high capacity or high velocity semi-automatic rifles. That bill is poorly drafted and overbroad, and it bans a lot more than just those rifles, including some pistols and including some shotguns. It is negligently badly written, and I can't help but believe that was done intentionally.
Yeah, I agree.
If I might jump in here, one of my favorite terms I think that I kept coming through my head as I watched you guys on the floor and in these meetings battling some of this stuff was brinkmanship. And I felt like it was such an important term that a lot of people don't use, and it's the art and practice of pursuing a dangerous policy to the limits of safety before stopping, especially in politics, to exact a desired outcome. And I think that's all these laws seem to be. If I may, the Q&A had a great question by Tio Morca. And he posted this, and it says, what can be done about the proliferation of rogue activist judges at local and federal levels who are openly ignoring state and federal constitutions and the SCOTUS rulings? What is the end game when these judges are effectively inventing their own interpretations of law and historical record?
All right. Well, that's a loaded question here, because there's a little thing called qualified immunity. So, you know, it's kind of hard to just start suing government actors because you don't like how they're acting. There is a sense of rogue judicial officers out there. We're seeing this. We saw a ruling that came out of Oregon just last week. Case is called Oregon Firearms Federation v. Kotek. It's their response on their ballot measure 114. A judge literally created a new rule out of law. There's always been the common use test. This judge created a new rule called common use for self-defense test. Never, ever heard of it before, but to apply the actual law would have meant that the Oregon Firearms Federation would have prevailed. This goes back to the point, especially in the state of Washington, when you have lived under a single party state for so long that you rot from the core all the way out. Okay. And what happens here is we have activist judges throughout this state. Many people think that judges get elected. The reality is most judges get appointed because some other judge resigns midterm. And then when they run for re-election the first time, they're running as an incumbent. Take a look across the state. You'll see most judges run unopposed. Okay. They're not like Senator Wilson and Representative Walsh. They're always going to get an opponent. Most of your judges will run unopposed. The power of incumbency is tremendous. There's also a reason why Washington state also pushes always to have any litigation related to constitutionality of any type of law argued in Thurston County, because they would rather have it at the center of the Death Star than anywhere else. Okay. So the unfortunate thing is, what can you do about these activist judges? You actually have to start all the way from a grassroots level, and you actually have to start changing the numbers politically in a state. That's the only way you can actually be done. Yeah, there's always going to be some judge, you hope, up above them that will eventually apply common sense in the Constitution. But the only way you're going to keep them out of the lower level benches, which is where they can do the most damage, is you actually have to start winning elections. It's really that simple.
And actually, if you stop and think about how long it took them to get these bills through, because we were inundated this year with really bad gun bills, and in committee, I asked Strom Peterson, who's been running the bill for 8 years, and he admitted he has he was going to leave the questions about guns to someone else because he didn't know what he was talking about. Which, okay, whatever. To admit that was kind of crazy to me. But it took them that long because of the makeup in one or the other house, right? When I first got in, we were only one apart when I first got into the House. That made them, they couldn't let anyone off of any vote. So they had to vote the way they had to hold those bills, to keep those bills from the ones they didn't want to pass, to not pass. But now, over the course of the years, we have our moderate senators have gone away. Well, as an example, so we have Senator Hobbs. He was very often in line with us in gun bills. He's National Guard. He would vote with us many times, and the governor knew that, right? The governor appointed him as Secretary of State when he had the opportunity. So we lost him. And then we ran a race, and right there in Representative Walsh's district, we ran a race and we won against Senator Taco. Taco was usually with us, as well as Blake in the House, but both of them are gone. So those numbers affect their ability to get things passed or not, because those that they are replacing are far more progressive and liberal than the ones that are leaving. And so that gives them stronger numbers on their side. And that's the reason why this year they were able to do so many of those bad bills.
Well, we replaced Taco and Blake with more strong constitutional conservatives. But Senator Wilson's right that the general drift has been away from moderate Democrats being in the legislature. What we can do about the rogue judges is the state Republican Party will take it on as a project to start tracking and scoring state judges. No one else is doing it, and I believe the state party is the right entity organization to systematically rate state judges. The judges, of course, are generally appointed, but then they are elected in nonpartisan elections to hold their positions, to hold their seats. And it's always been something where the parties have hesitated to get involved in any formal or official way because the races are nonpartisan races. But I think the situation in the state court system has eroded and collapsed to such a degree that that's a luxury we can't afford anymore. So I plan to encourage the state party to take on a project of scoring state judges. And it will not be an endorsement or non-endorsement, but we will give voters an idea of how these judges operate based on their rulings, based on that.
Well, with that in mind, Sharon Damoff has a great question. And as a follow-up to that, and is there something, she asked, that individuals can do to help these pending lawsuits or in these areas where these lawsuits are happening?
From a person who works with the folks that are working closely on those lawsuits, I think that a lot of people really want to know who are the groups that are really actually in the trenches, really fighting for their Second Amendment rights. I'm going to list 4, and this is the criteria that I use, which is I read and geek out and read these opinions every day. So I know who's filing lawsuits around the country, who's filing lawsuits in Washington State and around the country. I know who's doing the really good work. So groups like Firearms Policy Coalition on a national level, Gun Owners of America, and the Second Amendment Foundation, which is a national organization, but started here in Bellevue, Washington by a gentleman named Alan Gottlieb. Those 3 are fantastic organizations. On a statewide level, there's an organization called the Silent Majority Foundation. I think the world of them as well. So that is one thing you can do. The second thing you got to do is you've got to just educate your friends, your colleagues, and all of that. I think that all of us in the Second Amendment community, if we're going to be lawful and responsible gun owners, knowing that our rights are under attack, we have a moral obligation to educate. So we need to be discussing these issues in polite, educated ways so that people are really getting all of the information. And then the third thing is you guys do need to pay attention closer to the judicial elections than most of you do. Because most of you, unless you got a friend like me, you're just eeny, meeny, miny, mowing it. And you know you're doing it that way. I get about 20 phone calls the day before the ballots are due. Hey, Bill, who do I vote for in this election? Okay, so at least I get to get out information about 20 people, but all of you need to do your homework. The person who's running as the municipal court judge today that you don't think is a big deal is the one that ends up running for Superior Court judge in a few years and then ends up on the Court of Appeals a few years after that. And now they're making big time decisions that do affect all of your rights. So that's why you got to pay attention to this stuff.
I think we're all learning that the hard way. I know I have. Paying attention is something that's come slowly for some of us. Luke had another question. How do we fix the Washington Supreme Court? I guess this is sort of in line with this, maybe a little redundant, but how do we fix the Washington Supreme Court? And number 2, how can they delay the MAG injunction? When will we get an answer?
I'm going to let the politicians deal with the Supreme Court. I'll deal with the MAG stuff after that.
It's the same process as Superior Court judges. Supreme Court judges are often enter into their positions by governor's appointment, but then they are elected to maintain their positions. There have been a couple of concerted efforts in the last 10 years to get behind challengers, constitutionalists who would challenge constitutionalist lawyers or attorneys, or in a couple of cases judges, to challenge some of the sitting Supreme Court justices. And because these judicial elections are nonpartisan, and because they, by agreement among lawyers, judge candidates are very restricted in what they can speak about when they're running for a judge position or a state Supreme Court justice position. The elections end up being very favorable to incumbents because nobody knows who anybody is or what they're going to do. And we've had a couple of conservative judges who have tried several times to get onto the state Supreme Court by running as challengers to sitting justices, and they have consistently come up short because there's no effective way for them to explain and communicate to voters who they are and what kind of judge they are. And the judges and lawyers who are in a position to run the Supreme Court are bound, and they honor these sort of handshake agreements that they won't speak in any substantive way about how they would rule on specific cases.
All right. Then we had a question about the magazine ban.
Yes, I believe Mr. Luke is it Luke? It disappeared from mine. So, but yes, why has it been delayed? You brought up that something had happened. They said we were going to have a decision or December, but
Yep.
That's come and gone.
Yeah, I've talked to the attorney who's actually handling the litigation. None of us could figure out. We did think that the judge might be waiting for a ruling out of the United States District Court out of San Diego from Judge Benitez in a case that's basically identical to our case. That's a case called Duncan v. Bonta. The judge has not issued a ruling there. What concerns me now, though, is that Judge Karen Ermagert, that is actually her last name, Ermagert, out of Portland, has issued a ruling where she has upheld Oregon's magazine ban, and it would not surprise me, knowing the political makeup of the judge in the Eastern District of Washington, if she doesn't cut and paste from some of that. And I think we could get a ruling based on that, and that would not bode well. If you're cutting and pasting from the Oregon ruling, it's not going to bode well for us.
So it's just a matter of waiting for some of the other cases throughout the country to trickle down.
Yes. And ultimately, I think that we have two huge issues that are on a collision course to end up in the United States Supreme Court, not this coming term, but the year after.
Now, I've got a question, kind of an aside. I'll see if I can put this together off the top of my head. The Silent Majority of Foundation's lawsuit regarding 1240, and it got kicked from Grant County into Thurston County, right? Is that correct? And there's a judge that's now presiding over that in Thurston County, and she worked for the Attorney General's office. Am I incorrect about that? She served under the Attorney General's office?
Yes.
Now, is there not a conflict of interest in some manner there that it seems like, from my standpoint, as just a regular old blue collar guy out here in Washington, that there would be something that would prevent that sort of thing from happening?
Unless she had worked on that type of litigation, it would be really hard because, for example, I had the pleasure of working for Norm Mailing as a King County prosecutor when I first got out of law school, right? One of the great pleasures of my life. There are many of my colleagues that we prosecuted together that I now appear of that are judges. And most of them are really good judges. And so, this is pretty common here that we see this. The problem with that ruling coming out of Grant County is I think that we probably had a judge that would have been pretty good on the issue. But I think the judge made the right call here because there was no actual injury that had occurred in Grant County. If for example, there'd been an FFL who tried to sell an assault weapon and been cited with a criminal violation, that case would have stayed in Grant County at that point. The injury occurred there. The challenge to that law is going to happen there. What the judge did, and obviously if you're a judge and you don't have to rule on this issue, you don't want to because it's a big issue. What the judge ruled was, hey, there's no actual injury here in Grant County. The injury is speculative in nature. Therefore, you're basically suing on the implementation of the law, which occurred in Thurston County, and that's why it has to go there. On a side note, I do think, Senator Wilson, Representative Walsh, you need to be aware of this. State of Illinois just passed a law that said anytime you're going to challenge the constitutionality of anything in the state of Illinois, it's going to have to go through one of two counties. I do believe that the Democrats will try to do the same thing here on the next legislative session. I could see a bill kicking around to try to do that. Of course, they'll just try to steer everything into Thurston County and make that the Democratic stronghold.
Anything bad that's out there kicking around, they'll grab onto and run. That's what I've seen.
Yeah, no, the senator's right. The reason that I do my Washington stuff on a national level and then I talk about stuff that's going on in Illinois or Maryland is it's just a matter of time before you see that exact same legislation pop up in other jurisdictions. They're cutting and pasting. And we already know that Representative Liz Berry, who claims she writes all of these laws, doesn't write all of these laws. The folks at Giffords in Everytown actually writes it for her, and we've shown the emails of her trading the drafts back and forth, taking their advice about what to add. So, you know, there's a real question for those people who sit in Representative Berry's district, Lower Queen Anne, as to whether or not you're actually receiving representative government at the current time.
The Office of the Code Reviser can always tell legislators who actually write their bills and those who don't. And I put a lot of stock in the Office of the Code Reviser's reactions to bills as they're filed. And there are clearly legislators in Olympia who don't even read the bills that they file.
So, Bill, you brought up something I want to expand upon with this this bill that you think they're going to bring forward next session. And you and I spoke the other day. I was asking you what your prediction is for the 2024 legislative session, and you told me you'd been reading the tea leaves, and so I'm wondering if you can share what the tea leaves for you. And then I'd love to get, when you're done, I'd love for Senator Wilson and Rep. Walsh to jump in with their feedback.
Yeah, and I think that obviously the senator and the representative is going to have their hands on the pulse much greater than I will, but I do think they'll take another run at state preemption. I think that probably just got lost in the shuffle because they had a bigger, prettier prize to go get, which was the assault weapons. Let us all remember that the magazine ban had been introduced many times and had actually supposedly not happened one session, only to rear its ugly head last year and finally get passed. So I think they will make another significant run at that. What we're seeing on the national level and stuff that we need to be worried about: one, this moving things to a single jurisdiction to challenge the constitutionality. Number two, I want everyone to pay attention to a case out of San Jose. Mandatory liability insurance for all gun owners, upheld by a court in California. That should come as a shock to nobody. They will start this just like they do with the pre-purchasing license. It's going to be an innocuous fee. It's just a few bucks. It's just like this. And then next thing you know, you wake up 10 years in the future and it's $1,500 and 6 months worth of classes to do it. Okay. So those are the things that I'm most worried about as the outsider looking in, but I would be more interested in hearing those on the inside, what they think.
Well, that's that Senator Cooter is one of the biggest gun grabbers in Olympia, is running for insurance commissioner.
Mm-hmm.
And then the other one, right? Senator Gingrich is running for the attorney general. And you know, she wouldn't let bills out that even her own party wanted to vote on out of her committee. So, you know, that tells you kind of a little bit how she's going to rule. I agree that jurisdiction, the state preemption for counties what a mess that will be, but that's exactly where they want to go. I'm really worried about that one because we won't be able to drive from one city to the next without, putting ourselves in harm's way. We won't know what the rules are. And we won't, how do you keep track? I'm here 6 hours away in Spokane. How do I know what they're doing when I want to take a trip to Idaho, right? I have to drive right through it. That's exactly what they're trying to do. They want to make criminals out of us, law-abiding citizens. And so whatever way they can do it now, and we've seen the whole, right, 3 years ago when they wanted to do the magazine ban, and 3 years ago, it was 15 rounds. And then the next year they ran it and it went down to 10 rounds, right? So now we get to keep our assault weapons. Pretty soon they're going to have a reason why. Well, it's not, the numbers aren't coming down the way we want to. You can't keep your gun because someone's going to steal it from you. It's just going to be, this is what they do. They nudge us along a little bit at a time. And so, it's like, it's not, oh, phew, wait, yay, that one didn't pass. It's going to be, well, crap, now we're going to have to deal with it next year. That's really, nothing goes away, particularly now. Any bill that has been introduced last year and it didn't make it through is still live during that 2-year period. So whatever is out there is, easy for them to just run again. And they're setting the committees up to hear those bills right now. So it's not going to end until we can change the balance of power in the state. And that's really where it gets down to. If we don't change some of those numbers and get at least even closer numbers so that they can't all vote for this because, they won't get reelected if they vote a certain way in certain districts. If we don't change that, then we are going to be a lost cause. And so I'm hoping that, down the line, we keep fighting. We can't let this go. This is too important. We've seen this happen in other countries and what happens in these other countries, and it worries me a lot.
Well, it sounds like they're still trying to take everything they can. I think you guys are talking about, was it last year, the SB 5446 was a state preemption bill that was put forth. And it looked like it kind of died there toward the end, but it's still up for grabs is what you're saying, essentially. Now, with some of these challenges, will that in court, will that change the landscape of how things play out, do you think, in the coming months? It seems like Bruin didn't really sway anybody when it was brought up in debate. And do you think any of the upcoming, like with circuit court decisions, will change the minds of some of the legislators across the aisle?
No.
Pretty plainly spoken. Well, it's we're all hoping that was the case, I think.
Let's remember that with the assault weapon ban, there was proposals to have this thing more thoroughly analyzed by legal scholars to make sure it comports with Bruin and Heller and all things like that. There was also suggestion like, hey, let's put a potential sunset provision in this thing. Let's come back. Let's do a statewide study. Let's come back and take a look. Did it work? Did it not? Then we can decide, does it carry on? They wanted nothing to do with that. They wanted nothing to do with it. They wanted the ban, and now they don't want to talk about the numbers. So do you honestly think that suddenly, if there's more persuasive authority on the federal level, that the Strom Petersons and the Mark Liases of the world are going to be like, oh, you know what? We probably can't do it this time around. No, I don't think that's going to happen.
Well, and they do it anyway. They'll throw it out there and they'll start talking about it, but we don't know because they wait till the very end of session and then they pull these bills out and then they run them. And then we have to stay prepared for absolutely everything from the beginning to the end. And that doesn't mean that we're not going to go into a special session if they need extra time because they can call it. So, like what they did with the Blake decision last year, couldn't do it in 105 days. So we had to come back and do it again later down the road.
Senator, did you notice, and Representative Walsh, did you notice this year's legislative session, how, like, for example, 1143, 1240, 1178, a lot of these bills didn't have just a companion bill in the other chamber. They actually had multiple. There would be like 2 in the House, 2 in the Senate. They're all
Yeah.
encapsulating literally verbatim the same thing. And then it was like you're having to watch 4 bills on one topic, just
Yep.
waiting to see which one gets let out of the pen first.
Yeah, absolutely. Yep, because we would have, that would show up on a list as died or in the X file.
Yeah, nothing
And they're
happened.
going, oh yeah, phew, oh, wait a minute. And then realize that it's the House bill that's moving. Right, yeah, it's really, you got to really stay on your feet. It's not easy to keep track. That's why we depend on a lot of everyone emailing us. I got 12,000 emails last year just on gun bills because I'm on the committee, and and I was off the committee the year before because I took on the role with Ways and Means, but I'm like, I missed it. I really wanted to be back in the thick of things, to be in that committee to try to kill them before they can get out, but it's a lot. It's a lot of work to pay attention, and our poor staff, oh my gosh, a lot of late hours because you have to prepare those amendments. And how many amendments does the House prepare? And the House does more amendments than we do usually.
Yep.
And but they have to prepare them, Mark. We have to be ready for it, and then they'll pull the bill, and then all that time was wasted. But we have to do it. Yeah.
The multiple versions of the same bill is partly they're serving multiple masters. In the case of the 1143 and its sibling bill, one was every town's version and one was the governor's version. And they were almost identical, but because the legislators are doing what they're told, they have to make everybody happy, and they file multiple versions. And that's then it becomes a sort of battle of egos among their masters over whose version gets to the committee, gets to the floor.
Teo Marca has a question that's kind of following up on something Jim said earlier, and kind of tags onto what he was just saying, and also what Senator Wilson was saying. It was like herding cats or playing whack-a-mole with all of these gun bills during the session, and just as an activist trying to keep up with it and trying to alert citizens as to what was going on was crazy making, to say the least. And Teo was, you all might recognize his name. He did testify on a number of the bills, at least when we were allowed to testify, which something for our audience to know is there would be a number of people in the queue to testify either pro or con on these bills, and the Democrats get to decide who gets to speak. And so a lot of time they would run out the clock with their folks that were on their side, and we might get 5 or 10 minutes on the end. But he says, just to follow up with Representative Walsh's comments, we know that the anti-gun activist orgs like March for Our Lives, Moms Demand Action in Every Town for Gun Safety intend to target state level activism as their key engines to demonize guns from the grassroots level. Is there anything we can do to counter these massive pushes?
Just talk about the news. A young Korean woman gets shot in her car in downtown Seattle, 8 months pregnant, and she and the baby die. The shooter was a drug addict, mentally ill, multiple time felon. There are shootings every night in King County and Pierce County, and the phony sanctimony of groups like Every Town and Moms Demand Action just doesn't stand up to the truth.
That I think Jim is right on it. So many of them don't want to hear another side of the story, so they'll shut down because so much of it is the snippets that they hear from other people. They don't have actually background or facts on their own side. That's why it's hard for them to argue their side, right? They just state it and then you go on with it. That's really, I run into that in the position I'm in. I'll run into that. Well, how can you support people still owning guns with all these shootings? And it's like, well, let me tell you about the shootings, right? And who are doing the shootings, and how, if you talk about, I refer to John Lott quite often I can call him and he's right on top of what's going on everywhere. And he responds back to me so quickly. He's got so much information and research and data that is unbelievable and so helpful for me when I can, again, I'm trying to argue the facts, even though they don't want to hear them. But at some point, if everybody's saying the same thing on our side, then, you'd think that somewhere along the line, they're going to start paying attention. They're going to go, this argument isn't going to fly. You can't keep doing this over and over again, but they also have the power. And, that gavel is way powerful. And that, that's how you guys notice when you go in and you can testify and they cut you off. Well, you get 1 minute because we have so many people, right? How can you make a point in 1 minute? That's just so frustrating to us, particularly when we know who's there to testify and who can testify very succinctly. And then they cut them off or they don't let them testify at all. It's very frustrating.
They did let Trudy Inslee testify, though, a couple times.
Oh, yes, they did. Front and center. That's right.
She gets to go first because she's important and has important things to do, unlike the rest of us little peons. I've got a question here from Rob Hardy that I think is real good. Probably all of you might want to weigh in on this or tag team a little bit here. So what happens about all of these, quote, semi-automatic guns that people have owned for years now that they are illegal? Most of them have 20 and 30 round magazine. What happens to those?
That's an easy one, actually. They're all grandfathered in.
For now.
For now, that's right. The senator is right. You take one word, you add one word. All you got to do is add the word possess into any one of those statutes. And now we get into the whole Fifth Amendment constitutional takings and all that stuff that we don't have to geek out on tonight. But yeah, if you owned any of these firearms prior to the enactment of the law, they are grandfathered in. If you want to carry a 15-round magazine in your everyday concealed carry, as long as you had it prior to the enactment of the law, that is perfectly legal to do.
So here's an additional question, and this is just my question that maybe people might be wondering. Let's say they don't own a firearm right now. What can they buy? What's legal?
Handguns,
Most of them.
shotguns, lever action shotguns, bolt action rifles. So there's various firearms that are still available. If you're looking for home defense, self-defense, personal defense, the handgun is still, statistically speaking, by far the most popular firearm for that purpose. The only limitation is you may find a firearm that normally comes with a 15-round magazine. Yours will come with either a plugged magazine or a proprietary 10-round magazine. But beyond that, the firearm would be the same as what you would buy in other states.
And I should say that the lever action rifles have become popular in the wake of this. A lot of dealers are carrying more of those. It requires some training to get proficient in using, but someone who knows how to use a lever action rifle can use a lever action rifle very effectively.
So people are getting creative or willing to stretch beyond their maybe what they've heard.
I'd be surprised if you see a manufacturer such as like Aero Precision start making bolt action rifles that are also chambered in 5.56, 223, and 300 blackout. Because you could have a lot of components that could be sold for a lever action series that would also fit on a semi-automatic series of rifles.
And then it's just a matter of time before they make those illegal too, which brings us back to needing to, balance out the power in the legislature and, shift things to at least where we've got more Republicans, if not a majority. And my personal thought is that, if we focused on and Jim and Linda, of course, know more about this than I do. But if we focused on, obtaining a majority in one of the two chambers, that would be a huge a huge win for Washington, you know, maybe as opposed to trying to win the governor's seat, because you still have a Democrat legislature, which, you know, is going to make things really difficult. But Luke has asking a question kind of along those lines. Is the main issue ultimately is votes, hearts and minds. Democrats will win elections overwhelmingly. Can people be convinced to vote GOP, and what will it take to move folks away from the hard left?
You know, I'm seeing some of this happen now. I mean, I talk to people who say I won't ever vote for Democrat again, but because I have to believe that there's a tipping point somewhere, right? And that they're going to go a little too far. And when you see what's happening in our communities right now, and like, you know, the gun violence, right? And the murders going up, and the cars being stolen, and the drugs being taken, and so little is being done. I mean, we've gone so far backwards. It's going to take a while to get back again to where we want to be, where we were not all that long ago. But there's got to be a point where they're going to, even those thinking the other way, going to have some correlation as to what's happening here. Right. I have to believe that. And I talk, I know Jim talks, he does that all the time. He gets his message out on videos all the time. So, it's getting the message out. It's talking to people on a one-on-one level. Like Luke said, hearts and minds. You have to change their hearts and minds, realize that a gun is not going to go off by itself and hurt someone. It is the person behind the gun that is creating all this chaos. And that's what we have to look at. And I think we can get there, but I mean, it's going to take a lot of work.
What I would say real quick before Jim jumps in is, I honestly, as much as it pains me to say this, I don't think that Second Amendment issues in the state of Washington are the types of things that are going to drive a large chunk of people back to the Republican Party. I don't. I wish it were the case. I wish I didn't have to say that. I do think, though, that there are other issues out there that this Democratic Party in this state has chosen to embrace for whatever reason. Issues that, if you think gun control laws are not based in reality, other issues that are not based in reality, nor biology, nor science. And I think that is the tipping point that Senator Wilson's been talking about, where you can be pretty liberal, and at some point, are you willing to detach yourself from reality completely? Because that's what they're asking you to do now. And so I think that, they're real good at finding wedge issues and driving that into groups to try to split everyone up. What we need to do is find that wedge issue to drive people away from the Democratic Party in this state. And as much as I wish it was what they're doing to our Second Amendment rights, I think it's candidly what they want to do to our kids. That's the one that's going to get most people to turn on them.
I think you're absolutely right. And I think that, this session, they really overplayed their hand. They got national attention on Senate Bill 5599, and, people from parents of all political affiliations, want to be able to protect their children. And I think that we are going to start seeing things shift back, because I think that they are not going to be able to I don't think they can come back from how far left that they've gone. I think they can only
unring that bell. You can't unring that bell. We all know you went there. Okay. Exactly. And that's forever on their record.
Yeah. 100% agreed. Representative Walsh, I'm going to hand it over to you if you've got some closing remarks. We're getting to be about 8:30 here, so we're going to wrap up.
We turned the district I represent from what was perceived as being unchallengeable Democrat to very strong conservative constitutionalist Republican by speaking clearly and strongly about foundational constitutional rights, and that they are what make individuals strong, and families strong, and children strong, and businesses strong, and the state strong. and that we veered far away from that and we should get back to it. And I think we've floundered in this state as people who've read the Constitution and value its principles by trying to bargain with the left. And there's always a place for bargaining in the legislative process, but in the political process, you need to stand stronger and firmer on principle. And we've failed to do that in the last 10 years or so. And we paid the price for it in election losses. Now, you have to be smart about what you do. And you don't settle for any one wedge issue as the other side doesn't. You use multiple wedge issues. And while what's happened with parental rights is the clear and present problem, and what's happened with the tax on gas and diesel fuel is another, I think that what they're doing to gun rights is part of the equation. And I think we will use it as part of a multi-part campaign to return the state to the principles that made it strong. And, there's no time for equivocation. We can't wait for trends to follow our way and come our way. We've been doing that for too long. We don't wait for a wave to make the wave. And protecting every woman in Washington's right to defend herself is part of making the wave. And we're going to do that more strongly and more certainly.
Agreed. There are a lot of issues. I agree with you there. There's not just one specific wedge issue, and there's a lot of issues that people who aren't engaged politically at all care about: public safety, the gas prices, parental rights, education, and guns. It all ties in together. And I know that, I'm kind of reading through the chat this evening, and I see people are discouraged and feeling like we can't come back from this. And I just want to just encourage you and say, it's not over till it's over. And, we're still here. We've still got to fight. We've got, these great people like Senator Wilson and Representative Walsh who sit in this session for 105 days. I would be banging my head against the wall. I think my head would probably explode. I don't know how they do it. It's really quite amazing. And I would encourage you to get involved in the legislative session now that they can do the Zoom hybrid for testifying. It's really easy for citizens to testify. You get up there and you're on Zoom for 60 to 120 seconds max. And it's a great way to support these legislators because they can use your testimony in their committee hearings, and having just regular old citizens testify and speak to these issues is much more powerful than, a lobbyist or some, activist organization. So I would really encourage you to do that. We have a legislative action team. You can join us. We will teach you and train you and get you plugged in to a specific topic that you are particularly passionate about. You can learn about that on our website, conservativeladiesofwa.com, and we'll be firing up our legislative action team meetings on Monday nights again at the end of August. So encourage you to join us. We all need to get in this fight, and whether you have 5 minutes a week or 5 hours, we will find a place to plug you in. And I just want to thank our panel tonight: Senator Wilson, Representative Walsh, Bill Kirk. You guys are heroes for Washington. Appreciate all you do, the fight that you give. Bill, all of the education, and your YouTube channel. Everybody, you can find Bill, if you haven't already, on YouTube at Washington Gun Law over there. And he's consistently putting out great education on the Second Amendment with videos about Washington gun law, as well as things that are going on all across the country that you should be aware about. So go over to YouTube, like and subscribe, and be sure to share those videos with people in your network. And please do everything that you can to support these legislators. Jim is up for re-election. Senator Wilson, are you up for re-election in 2024 would be? Yep. Will that be your year?
Yep. Presidential year.
Yep.
Yes.
So you'll want to support these legislators in their reelection campaigns, please, and just donate directly to them. We'll once the campaigns start really launching, we'll throw those links out for you guys to go donate. But thank you so much for your service to our state. Thank you so much for your time this evening, and we wish you all a good evening, and we'll see you again next time. Have a good night.
Thank you. You too.
Thanks.